At the top of a 400-foot cliff on Okinawa, one American soldier stayed behind when everyone else pulled back. He had no weapon. He had never carried one. The order to withdraw came in the early afternoon of the 2nd of May, 1945. Artillery and machine gun fire had torn through the company on the summit. Roughly 75 men were down and the rest were coming off the ridge. At the bottom, the officers counted heads and waited. And then someone looking up at the escarpment saw a rope go taut over the edge, and a man in a litter come down the rock face, lowered, alone, by somebody still up there. Then another. And another. All afternoon and into the dark, the rope kept moving. Nobody had ordered it. Nobody expected it. The men at the bottom simply kept receiving wounded, one at a time, lowered off a cliff that was still in enemy hands, by a private who had refused, from the day he was drafted, to touch a rifle. 2 years earlier, the United States Army had tried to have that same man declared mentally unfit, then tried to court-martial him, then tried simply to make his life unbearable enough that he would quit. He would not quit. What he did on that ridge changed the minds of every man who had spent a year despising him, and it is not the part of his story that surprises people most. His name was Desmond Doss. He was born in 1919 in Lynchburg, Virginia, in a poor family in the Blue Ridge foothills, and he grew up a Seventh-day Adventist, a faith that kept the Sabbath on Saturday, avoided meat, and took the sixth commandment absolutely literally, "Thou shalt not kill." There is a story he told for the rest of his life about where that came from. On the wall of the family home hung a framed illustration of the 10 Commandments, and beside the sixth was a picture of Cain standing over the body of Abel. Doss said he stared at it as a small boy and asked how a brother could do that. He also grew up in a house where his father, a veteran of the First World War, once got hold of a pistol in a family argument, and young Desmond took it away and threw it out. He never touched a firearm again. When war came, he could have stayed out of it entirely. He had a deferment. He was working in a shipyard in Newport News, and shipyard work was classified as essential. Instead he gave up the deferment and let himself be drafted. He wanted to serve, he said, and he wanted to serve as a medic, because he could not see how a man who believed the world was tearing itself apart could stand aside and do nothing about the wounded. And this is the distinction that mattered to him, and that almost nobody in his unit understood at first. He did not consider himself a conscientious objector. He objected to nothing about the war. He was, in his own phrase, a conscientious cooperator. He would go anywhere the army sent him, into any fire, on any day. He simply would not carry the weapon, and he would not work on Saturday if there was any way around it. The army did not know what to do with that, so it tried to break him. His company commander attempted to get him transferred out on a psychiatric discharge. Officers threatened him with court-martial. He was given every filthy detail in the battalion, refused passes, and told repeatedly that he would be responsible for the deaths of his friends when the shooting started. The men were worse than the officers. He was mocked at meals and shoved in formation. One soldier told him he would shoot him himself the first time they went into combat. Another threw a boot at him while he knelt to pray at the foot of his bunk. Doss finished the prayer, picked up the boot, and put it back beside the man's bed. He never once reported anybody, which infuriated them further. 2 things kept him in the army. The first was a legal detail. The army could not simply throw him out, because he had never actually refused an order. He had only refused to carry a rifle, and no regulation required a medic to carry one. The second was more stubborn than legal. He had told his church, his family and his fiancée Dorothy that he was going, and he was not coming home early because a barracks full of men found him ridiculous. Understand what a company aide man actually did, because the job explains the man. He carried no rifle, no grenades, no pack of rations worth stealing. He carried 2 canvas pouches of bandages, sulfa powder, morphine syrettes and plasma, and he went where the shooting was, because that is where the wounded were. On a good day he was the most valuable man in the company. On a bad day he was a target crawling in the open with both hands full. He went to the Pacific with the 77th Infantry Division, and the ridicule ended faster than anyone expected. On Guam and then on Leyte in the Philippines, Doss went out to wounded men in the open under fire, again and again, and brought them back. He earned 2 Bronze Stars with the V device for valor before Okinawa was even a rumor. The men who had thrown boots at him started calling him for help by name. Then came Okinawa, and the last great battle of the Pacific War. Look at the ground. The island runs 80 miles long, and the Japanese 32nd Army had given up the beaches entirely to fortify a belt of ridges across the southern third, honeycombed with caves and tunnels. The Americans landed unopposed on the 1st of April, walked south, and hit that belt. Okinawa is also where the arithmetic of the Pacific War became unbearable. The island was Japanese home soil in a way the Philippines and Guam had not been, and it was the last barrier before the mainland. Both sides understood what the fighting there was really about, a rehearsal, and an argument about what invading Japan itself would cost. By the time it ended in June, the battle would kill more than 12,000 Americans, upwards of 70,000 Japanese soldiers, and, by most estimates, over 100,000 Okinawan civilians. The strong point in front of the 77th Division was the Maeda escarpment, a wall of coral rising 400 feet, with the last 30 or 40 feet a sheer vertical face. To attack it, the infantry had to climb cargo nets and rope ladders up that final cliff, and then fight across a flat plateau riddled with tunnels, where the defenders could disappear underground, let the Americans pass, and come up behind them. And the plateau on top was worse than the climb. The Japanese had spent months turning the coral into a fortress that worked in 3 dimensions, tunnels connecting reverse slope caves, firing ports at ground level, shafts that let a machine gun crew fight, drop underground, and reappear 200 yards away. American troops would take a position, consolidate, and be shot at from ground they had already cleared. Nothing on that ridge stayed taken. The Americans took the top and were thrown off it. Took it again, and were thrown off again. The men started calling it Hacksaw Ridge. By late April the fighting on that plateau had reached a state where units were being chewed down to fractions in a single afternoon, and the wounded were the hardest problem of all, because a stretcher cannot climb a cliff. It is worth knowing what happened to the ridge itself, because the men paid for every yard of it twice. The 77th Division finally cleared the Maeda escarpment on the 6th of May, after a week of fighting in which companies were rebuilt from replacements more than once. The method that finally worked was not clever, engineers with satchel charges and flamethrower teams working the caves one at a time, sealing them, while riflemen held the ground above. The plateau is perhaps 300 yards deep. It cost the division most of a rifle battalion. On the 2nd of May, the 1st Battalion went up onto the plateau in strength, and the Japanese let them come. Then artillery, mortars and machine guns opened from 3 sides at once. Roughly a third of the company went down in minutes. The order came to pull back off the summit and get down the cliff before the counterattack came in. Doss did not go down. He said afterwards that he could not, that there were men out there who would be killed where they lay if the position was overrun, and that he was the only aid man still on top. So he stayed on a plateau held by the enemy, in the open, and started dragging wounded men to the edge of the cliff one at a time. At the edge he did something he had worked out himself. He took a rope-supported litter, tied a knot he had learned years earlier as a boy in Virginia, a double bowline that would not tighten on a wounded man's legs, anchored it to a tree stump, and lowered each man down the face of the escarpment to the medics waiting below. Then he went back for the next one. He did that for something like 5 hours. He was alone the entire time. Japanese soldiers were on the plateau with him, he was shot at repeatedly and, by his own account, walked past enemy positions close enough to hear men talking. And what he said he prayed, over and over, has become the most quoted sentence of the whole battle: "Lord, please help me get one more." Think about the physical labor of it for a second, because the heroism tends to hide the work. A wounded man in full kit weighs perhaps 180 pounds. Doss had to reach him, often by crawling, drag or carry him across open rock, lift that weight into a litter, work the rope over an edge of raw coral that cut into the line every time it moved, lower him 35 feet without letting the litter tip, and then haul the empty rope back up, and do all of it again, dozens of times, in the dark, wet, and hunted. When the officers below finally counted, they estimated he had brought down 100 men. Doss said it was closer to 50. The army split the difference and put 75 in the citation, and that compromise number is the one history kept. All of them were carried off a cliff by a man who had spent a year being told he was useless because he would not hold a gun. What is less known is that the 2nd of May was not the end of it, it was the beginning of 3 weeks that read like a list of things a man should not survive. On the 4th of May he crawled to 4 men cut down assaulting a cave, treated them within a few yards of the enemy position, and made 4 separate trips under fire to get them out. On the 5th of May, a Saturday, his Sabbath, he was found treating an artillery officer under shellfire, and later crawled 25 feet from an enemy cave mouth to reach a wounded man and carry him 100 yards to safety. He had asked permission to keep the Sabbath. He kept working on it anyway, every time, and never seems to have considered that a contradiction. On the night of the 21st of May, in a night attack near Shuri, a grenade landed in the hole he was sharing. He took most of it in the legs, 17 pieces of shrapnel. He was 5 hours from help, so he treated his own wounds and waited, rather than call another medic out into the dark. When litter bearers finally reached him, he rolled off the stretcher and told them to take a man he judged worse off first. While he waited for the bearers to come back, a sniper's bullet shattered his left arm. He splinted it with a rifle stock, the only time in the entire war he is known to have held a rifle, and he was using it as a piece of medical equipment, and then crawled 300 yards over broken ground to the aid station. Somewhere in all of that he lost the small Bible his wife had given him. His unit went back onto the ridge later and searched the ground until they found it. There is one more thing worth saying about the men who despised him in 1943, because it is the part that gets sentimentalized and should not be. They did not come around because Doss preached at them, he never did. They came around because of a purely practical discovery: the man who would not carry a rifle turned out to be the one who would come out to get you. Captain Jack Glover, who had tried hardest to have him transferred out of the company, spent the rest of his life saying publicly that he had been wrong about Desmond Doss, and that Doss was the bravest man he ever knew. On the 12th of October, 1945, on the White House lawn, President Truman took Desmond Doss's hand and would not let go of it while the citation was read. Doss was the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor. Truman told him he considered the honor greater than being president. Read the citation itself, and the striking thing is how boring the language is. It is written in the flat administrative prose of the Army: dates, distances, numbers of trips, and that flatness is what makes it land. 4 separate trips under fire. 25 feet from the enemy. 100 yards. 300 yards with a shattered arm. It reads like a maintenance log of an ordinary man doing an impossible thing on a schedule. The war did not finish with him. The tuberculosis he had picked up on Leyte cost him a lung and 5 years in and out of military hospitals. An overdose of antibiotics for the tuberculosis destroyed his hearing. He was deaf for years until a cochlear implant in 1988 partly restored it. He was discharged with a disability rating and lived quietly on a small holding in Georgia, and later Alabama, with Dorothy. He turned down film offers for decades. Hollywood came to him more than once, and he refused every time, because the scripts wanted to invent things, a scene where he picks up a weapon, a romance rewritten, a body count added. He said he would allow a film only if it stayed with what actually happened. The film that finally satisfied that condition, Hacksaw Ridge, came out 10 years after his death. Desmond Doss died on the 23rd of March, 2006, aged 87. At his funeral, the men still living who had been carried down that cliff were in the church. Some of them had spent 1943 making his life miserable. All of them had spent the 60 years since telling anyone who would listen that they were alive because a man who would not carry a gun refused to leave the top of a ridge. So here is what this story leaves behind, and it is not the number. Every other man on that ridge was armed, trained, and doing exactly what he had been ordered to do, and they were right to pull back. The position was untenable. Doss was the one who stayed, and the reason he could stay was the same conviction that had made him useless in the eyes of his own unit for a year. The thing they despised him for was the thing that saved them. Would you have stayed on that ridge? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe. Every battle comes down to one moment. The last salvo.